Question number 16 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 4. So 16 is a paired question with 17 where you have to find the quotes for 17. Let's see if we can answer 16 though by itself. The passage implies that American cities in 1974. When do we talk about cities in 1974? Line 65. Burgess was right about the urban America of 1925. And what was his urban America in 1925? That it was a 4-zone settlement, a central business district, an area of manufacturing, a residential area by industrial and immigrant workers, and finally single-dwelling family suburbs. He was right about the urban America of 1925, and he was right about the urban America of 1974, i.e., the America of 1974 was exactly in the same construction as it was in 1925. Virtually every city, now we read this quote in blue, line 66, virtually every city in the country had a downtown where the commercial life of the metropolis was conducted. It had a factory district that had working class residences and wealthy upper middle class suburbs. So he's saying that the America of 1974, the suburban America, was exactly the same in 1925. That is, it maintained a central business district, manufacturing, immigrant and working class neighborhoods, and finally suburban affluent communities. So the passage implies. So implies means that it's not directly stated, but it's all the information. There's a tidal wave of information that's leaning towards this conclusion that is to be inferred. That American cities in 1974 were witnessing the flight of minority populations to the suburbs. That's not true, because he's saying that what was true in 1925 was true in 1974. And what was true in 1925? The 4 urban suburban zones of settlement. So there aren't minority populations to the suburbs. That, if anything, is happening in 2000, not in 1974. Remember, we have to be very year specific here when we talk about 1974. B, had begun to lose their manufacturing sectors. They never talked about that in 1974. They talk about that later in the past decade. There are no factories lying next to them, line 83, 84. So that's not talking about 1974. To be very precise in answering the question being asked. C, had a traditional 4-zone structure. Yes, even though this is I bet you a lot of you guys got this wrong because you didn't even understand what was going on. You were kind of, blindsided by the question. And if you didn't pick up on the fact that 1974 is the only thing we care about, identifying how the city was in 1974 is the only thing that matters. If you were oblivious to that fact, it would have been very hard to pick C because it's so obvious. It's hidden in plain sight. It's so basic, which is why it is so difficult to pick and why it's so, I think, scary. It's such a scary answer choice. D, the passage implies that American cities in 1974 were already experiencing demographic inversion. They're not saying that. They're saying actually in 1974 it was the same thing in 1925. Notice this little stupid triangle I made. We're talking about the connection from 1974 is the same as it was in 1925. And what is true in 1925? 4 urban suburban zones of settlement. And what was true in 1974 with this blue quote that starts on line 66? There were 4 zones of urban settlement. So I think the answer to number 16 is going to be C. But just to be sure, let's take a look at the quotes and support the answer that way. Question number 17 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 4. So 17 is the quote question to number 16. 16 is asking, the passage implies that American cities in 1974. And we said, well, we found 1974 in line 65, and line 65 said that the city in 1974 was exactly the same as it was in 1925, i.e. it had 4 urban zones of settlement. So we think the answer to number 16 is going to be C. But let's take a look at the answer choices to 17. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So let's pretend like these answer choices don't even exist. A, B, C, D of 16 don't even exist. We have to answer a very specific question. And that very specific question is, what can we imply about an American city in 1974? 54 to 57. Much of our perspective on the process of metropolitan settlement dates, whether we realize it or not, from a paper written in 1925 by the Chicago sociologist Ernst W. Burgess. Problem. Even though it might be true that the city of 1974 had the understanding of the metropolitan settlement of 1925, it's not talking about the city in 1974. We're talking about 1925 here only. It can't be that. What about 58 to 59? It was Burgess who defined 4 urban-suburban zones of settlement. This is a good bad answer. It's a good bad answer because this is saying Burgess defined 4 zones of settlement. And you're like, oh, okay, 4 zones of settlement. Maybe even you got that 4 and you're saying that's how it's going to be in 1974. Again, is he talking about 1974 in line 58 and 59? No, we're not talking about 1974, even though that is talking about the architecture for how the city is laid out. In no way are we talking about how the city is defined in 1974. We know that just from the text that the city of 1925 was the same as the city of 1974, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can say that this quote is going to define how the city in 1974 was. Just because we know how the city in 1925 was with this quote does not necessarily imply now that we know how the city was in 1974. Even though later on we do know that they were similar, chronologically in the piece, we don't know anything at this point about 1974 or how the city was. What about C? I think I like C because C is going to talk about the city in 1974. In line 66, right before he says he was right about the urban city in 1925, he was right in 1974, and now we're going to define why he was right about the city in 1974. Virtually every city in the country had a downtown, and this is every city in the country in 1974, because we already talked about what every city in the country in 1925 had, the 4 zones. In 1974, you had downtown, commercial life, it had factory district, it had district of working class residences, and it had residential suburbs for the wealthy. I like that a lot because C in this case is going to nicely talk about the answer choice that matched up with C in 16. That in 1974 it had a traditional 4-zone structure, and we directly say that in 1974 virtually every city had a downtown, factory district, working class, and suburban residences. So I really like C for 17. What about D? Does this talk about something about American cities in 1974? As a family moved up the economic ladder, it also moved outward in the crowded working class districts to more spacious apartments and eventually to a suburban home. So that might be true about, this is a really good bad answer actually for D. Because you might argue, well, isn't that demographic inversion that you're moving from that in 1974, it's saying right after the heels of how we described the city in 1974, you might argue, as the family moved up the economic ladder, it moved outward until, the more money you had, the further out you moved from the city. And the problem with that, though, is that is not demographic inversion. That is how the city naturally flows. Like, demographic inversion, if you remember from the title, is a phenomenon that describes the rearrangement of living patterns through a metropolitan area. And maybe broadly speaking, you can say that as people got richer, you move outward, that in a way is demographic inversion. But demographic inversion, at least from my understanding of this piece, is what we talked about with African Americans in Chicago, about immigrant groups in the suburbs, on how it's the flow of people, not necessarily what is expected to happen, which seems like what was expected to happen in 1925 and what was expected to happen in 1974, and what was even expected to happen all the way up until the turn of the century. So even though this quote talks about moving up and out, is that what the author is implying in 1974? They were already experiencing demographic inversion? Maybe another way of thinking about this too is that they're directly saying that even if you take it to be true, like, no, he's talking about demographic inversion there, which I'm still not convinced of. Let's take that to be true, that yes, that is demographic inversion. Is he implying that? Is he implying that there's already experiencing demographic inversion, or is he explicitly stating it? I don't know. And furthermore, this is another great example of how we can get lost in our own logic trying to make an answer right. When we need to realize, okay, irrefutably, did the city in 1974 have a traditional 4-zone structure? Yes, it did. Like, you can't argue that it didn't, because he says it. And what's the quote that talks about that? Well, the blue quote, 66 to 71. Does it say that there was a 4-zone structure in 1974? Yes, it did. So I like the answer choices that are just irrefutable rather than the ones that require me to maybe come up with a logic in order to make it correct. I understand if you picked 16D and 17D, and that's a really good bad answer, but understand where D for 16 falls short. That I'm not entirely sure that that is demographic inversion just from moving out of a city, but even if it is that something that the author is implying about the cities in 1974? It's like, hey, this demographic inversion thing was happening back then. I would argue that he's saying that the city of 1974 was similar to 1925 in that it was exactly the same. Nothing changed. There was no inversion. There was no dynamic movement of people. It was as it was in 1925. So, again, I really sympathize. I understand if you pick D and D for that. But I really find it hard to believe that D and D, when we flip the logic, is more easily to be proven correct, or is more irrefutable than C and C. It's like, you have to just ask yourself that sometimes. When you're down between answers, you say, okay, let's assume one is true. Is the other one irrefutable? Is the other one impossible to be proven wrong? And I'm already poking holes in D, and I'm not even really convinced, that it's right. So, but can I refute C for 16 and 17? Can I say, no, that's not right? It's impossible. He said it. He said that there was a 4-zone structure, and he's saying how it was in 1974, right after the part where he discusses the year 1974. How is that possibly wrong? I think that's the healthier way of thinking about this problem. Very tough and very understandable if you pick D and D, but realize why that falls short and why there ultimately is the better answer, or the least bad answer of the bunch, and why D and D, even though it could be right in some universe, I think it doesn't make the cut of being the least bad answer here. Forget about if it could be right. We don't care about that. We need to find the least bad answer in this case. The answer number 16 is going to be C. Answer 17 is going to be C.